right now. My name is George Gammon, and this channel is all about helping you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments. So hit the subscribe button right now so you don't miss a thing. I'm going to explain this to you guys in 5 steps. Step number 1, structure and numbers of hyperinflation. How does this actually work? To find this out, I looked at a study from the IMF where they looked into 19 different countries who have experienced hyperinflation. And they found that hyperinflation actually works in cycles. They found these cycles work in 2 stages, and each stage has 2 separate phases, so 4 phases total. The first stage is the rise, and the second stage is the fall. In the rise, you've got 2 phases, the acceleration phase and hyperinflation. Acceleration phase is defined by inflation of 50 to 500% annually. The hyperinflation phase is defined by 500% plus annual inflation. Going over to the fall, the disinflation phase is minus or anything less than 500%. And the stabilization phase is anything less than 50%. They found that the average duration for one of these hyperinflation cycles is 16 to 17 years. Think about your country dealing with this for 17 years. Just phase number 1, which is what I want to focus on today when we're looking at the United States, is 8 to 9 years. For more specific information, let's look at a data table from this IMF study. And you can see the damage that hyperinflation does over on the right when we look at the average annual rate of inflation through that time period. But look at Congo. Their average annual inflation over 31 years was over 1,000%. Really hard to get your mind around that. The least amount of inflation was Russia from 93 to 2004. That lasted 12 years. They had an average annual inflation rate of 137% a year, and that was the lowest out of the group. This table looks at the entire cycle of hyperinflation in each one of these countries. But taking it back to the United States, I want to focus on the first phase of inflation. Remember, we said that averaged 8 to 9 years, but it can be as short as 1 to 2 years, which was experienced in Bolivia and Chile, and 3 years in Croatia. And I point that out because if we were to get to the first phase of hyperinflation in the United States, obviously it's not here now, but if we were to get there in the future, we could see hyperinflation in the United States, which is the second phase, in as low as a year from when the first phase starts. Step number 2, I want to reflect a little bit. I know hyperinflation can seem like a bunch of numbers and just crazy statistics, but it's not about that. It's about everyday living and breathing people and how it affects their lives. As an example of this, I want to tell you a quick story that I read in the Sovereign Man blog. And if you're not reading that blog, I'll put a link below. You need to start right now. But this story is about a German by the name of Maximilian Bern. Maximilian Bern was an older gentleman that saved and worked his entire life to save up 100,000 of his dollars so he could retire. One day, he went to the bank and he withdrew every single dime he had for one single purchase. That purchase was to buy a subway ticket. He bought the ticket, he took his trip on the subway around the entire city, and then Maximilian went into his house, he locked the door, and he died. You say, well, my gosh, did he commit suicide? What happened? No. Maximilian Bern actually died of starvation. Why? Because hyperinflation had eaten away so much purchasing power of his savings that his entire savings, the $100,000 that he had, was only enough to buy one egg. It's a very sad story, but I wanted to tell that story because it really drives home the point that this isn't just about looking at statistics in history and looking at governments who just got wildly out of control. It's about how inflation, the dollar collapse, could actually affect everyday people just like you. Step number 3, how does hyperinflation happen? Or how could the dollar collapse happen in the United States? To answer this question, we're going to look at a great article from Business Insider where they look at 10 different examples of hyperinflation. We're going to focus on 5. First is Chile. The way they brought on their bout of hyperinflation, they started by nationalizing a lot of the major companies, and they gave private land to the workers. In other words, they gave this land to the workers so that they could make money off of their labor. The problem with that is that the workers really didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know how to leverage that land. And the government definitely didn't know how to run these companies. So the economy tanked and they started printing money to control the decline of the economy. But the amount of money that they printed resulted in hyperinflation. So I want to ask you the question, you Americans, would you see this happening in the United States? You say, oh no, that's ridiculous. Really? Look at the Democratic candidates right now. Look at AOC. Do you think they might be in favor of taking over ExxonMobil to distribute those profits to people who deserve it more, like the normal everyday people? Or how about the banks? Do you think they'd be in favor of taking over the banks so that they could distribute those profits and people who really deserve the loans could get loans? Or how many of those candidates do you think would be in favor of having workers take over more control of the companies where they work? Look at Argentina's hyperinflation, a result of massive external borrowing, meaning the government spent, and to fund that spending, they had to issue bonds that foreigners purchased. I'd like to ask you a question. Who is the largest debtor nation in the entire world, in the history of the entire world? Answer? The United States of America right now. Moving on, China. They nationalized their banks, they set up a fiat currency, and they monetized their debt. So what did we do in the great financial crisis? We came very close to nationalizing our banks in the United States. Fiat currency, been there, done that, 1971. Monetized the debt. What is another name for monetizing the debt? Answer? Quantitative easing, QE. Moving on to Zimbabwe. Massive government spending on social programs. What's another word for that? It's a fancy acronym and you hear it in the media all the time right now in the US. MMT, modern monetary theory. Moving on, Yugoslavia. I don't really think how they created the hyperinflation is important. What I do think is really important is their quote-unquote solution. They went into all their citizens' savings account and just basically stole all their money. That was their grand solution. So I ask you, do you think that could happen in the United States? And your answer is probably no, of course not, George. That would never happen in the United States. But let me pose that question to you in a little different way. Do you think in the next financial crisis, everything comes crashing down, there's no trust in the banks, there's no more trust in the stock market, the government comes in and says, listen, what we'll do is we'll take control of your 401k because it's going to be safe. And we'll just take that 401k and we'll invest strictly in debt of the United States, so in T-bills and in treasuries. And we're doing this for your own good. We're doing this for your safety. So they issue all these new treasuries and put them in your 401k. And after they've done that, then they inflate away the value of that debt. That is a transfer of wealth from you, the creditor, to the United States government, who is the debtor. What is the difference between doing this and just going in and stealing your savings account? It has the exact same effect. Quick bonus before we go to step number 4. What exactly does hyperinflation look like? Let's go to thevisualcapitalist.com to see a visual representation of the Venezuelan bolivar starting in 2012. In 2012, the US dollar could buy 4 bolivars. At the end of 2015, 900. Going down by the end of 2017, 90,000. We keep scrolling and scrolling, scrolling. Still going. And we get to the end. That's what hyperinflation, or the dollar collapse, could look like in just a few short years. Step number 4. Let's go over key statistics from the IMF study and compare the hyperinflation countries to the United States in 2019. First, we've got the deficit as a percentage of GDPs, the annual deficit. The hyperinflation countries, their average is 5%. Right now in the United States, what is our annual deficit running as a percentage of GDP? Any guesses? 4.6%. Tax revenue as a percentage of GDP. The hyperinflation countries average about 16%. What are we averaging right now in the United States? 16%. Change in base money. Annually, it goes between 50% to 200% of an increase of their base money. That's the average for the hyperinflation countries. Let's look at a quick chart to see what the United States change in base money was in 2010. 100%. The government debt to GDP. The hyperinflation countries had an average of 115%. What is the United States debt to GDP in 2019? 110%. I want to be clear. I'm not saying that because these numbers are almost identical to the numbers that we have in the hyperinflation countries, that the United States is headed for hyperinflation in the next year or even the next 10 years. What I am saying is these numbers are not good. And if we keep this up in the United States, we very well could see inflation in the future that would lead to hyperinflation. In other words, the dollar collapse. Step number 5. Earlier we told the story of the devastations of hyperinflation. But I want you to understand that if you know what you're doing, if you position yourself well, if you can see it coming, if you can read the tea leaves, if you actually pay attention to this stuff and watch these videos, you can not only survive the dollar collapse, but you can thrive. Let me tell you another story. This is from the same blog post in sovereignman.com. This gentleman, another German, by the name of Hugo Stins. He saw the hyperinflation coming. He was paying attention. So what he did is he went out and took on as much fixed rate debt as he possibly could to buy hard assets that produced cash flow. Additionally, he bought as much gold as he could. Hyperinflation came in just like he knew it would, and it wiped out the value of all of his debt. But he still owned those hard assets. Hugo turned into one of the richest men in the entire world because of that hyperinflation. So if you pay attention to what's coming down the road, if you get prepared, if the dollar collapse happens, whether it's in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, you can build your wealth instead of being a victim, just like Hugo did. For more information on inflation, check out this content right here. and I will see you on the next video.